Hill. Good morning. How is everyone? I was about to say they missed the grace and peace, so you can text while I'm speaking. I won't be offended. But then they got it, so they didn't need me. Well, good morning. My name is Kristi. I'm one of the pastors here at Smoky Hill, and today is a big day, right? We are so glad that each one of you is with us. It's very exciting. We're here to celebrate all that SHV has been to us personally and in this community, and to look with expectant hearts towards the future, into this next chapter. So we actually will have, like Joan said, we'll have instructions for you at the end of service of how we're gonna kind of close out and the way we're gonna bless the school that currently is leasing, but will be actually purchasing the building from us in about a week, and then actually have some family time together. We're all gonna go together to our new location and be able to just be together as the family of Christ, okay? So today we're finishing up the series, A Seat at the Table, and we're moving into our next series, which is the next chapter, which feels pretty significant for what we're going through right now. Today, when I consider, thinking about what's the last sermon for this series, for A Seat at the Table, I of course go to the Last Supper. I go to those seats that were filled at the Last Supper, right alongside Jesus, the final meal that he shared with his closest friends, with his disciples, right? That's where I go when I think about the seats. And from a biblical perspective, this is an incredibly significant event. It was celebrated, the Last Supper was the first day of Passover, or the Festival of Unleavened Bread, as it's called. And it's a remembrance of Israel being freed from slavery in Egypt. And so what actually happened, if you don't know, is there would be a sacrificial lamb, and the Israelites would actually paint their door frames, the door jamb, or whatever that's called, with the blood of the sacrificial lamb as a sign that when the angel of death came through, it would pass over the homes of the Israelites. Therefore, Passover. So this is actually the beginning of the celebration of the freedom of the Israelites from slavery. It's a remembrance of that time. And so when I think about this, I think, of course, of Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper painting, right? Are you guys familiar with that? Many are familiar with this very common scene of the Last Supper. Here's a couple interesting information, or bits of information, because I kind of go down my little nerd path when I start researching things like this. But I do think it kind of makes the scene come to life a bit. It was a late 15th century mural by the Italian artist Leonardo da Vinci. Its permanent home, most of us think of this as a painting that hangs in the Louvre or another prestigious art institute, right? But in fact, the permanent home is on the dining hall wall of a convent in Italy, the Santa Maria delle Grazie. And the original size of this painting was 15 by 29. So imagine me 3 high and 6 long. Okay, does that give you perspective of how big this is? It's massive. 3 of me high and 6 of me long, 15 by 29. And then, of course, we know in the picture Judas Iscariot, it's all the disciples, but Judas Iscariot is the 5th from the left, and he's pretty easy to spot because he's got the telltale bag of silver, right? And the picture was actually meant to capture the moment after Jesus told his disciples that one of them would betray him. This shock and this surprise, and is it gonna be me? Is it you? Jesus, let it not be me, right? And it was actually a painting that was done as an experimental painting. It was not a fresco, which would be a painting on fresh plaster, but it was one that Leonardo da Vinci actually kind of tried something new, and he was doing this experiment that essentially failed miserably, and within 50 years, the paint had completely flaked off and had pretty much destroyed the painting. And then you add to that, there was a doorway that was put in 1952 in the convent that actually cut off Jesus' feet, and then there was Allied bombing, of course, from the World War that further destroyed the painting. And so over the years, there's been these incredible, this 19-year effort to restore the painting. And it's a pretty significant deal. And I believe a lot of people pilgrimage to this particular convent to go and see the Last Supper, right? But what I want us to consider this morning is who's actually sitting at the table with Jesus. We know that Jesus has done all kinds of incredible miracles, right? There have been throngs of people following him. All over, thousands of people following this man wherever he went, to be healed, to hear him speak, to touch the hem of his garment, right? To just draw near to Jesus. But who's with him in the very last day of his life? The 12 that are seated at his table. We're going to take a look at these 12 disciples because I think that there's some that are really familiar to us, right? Some of us may love Peter, who tends to stumble over his own feet and speaks before he thinks and has no filter. I love Peter. Some of us may like Matthew, the criminal, the tax collector, because it reminds us that we don't have to be perfect. In fact, we don't even have to be anywhere near perfect for the Lord to call us and say, you're invited to sit at this table. So today we're going to take a quick look at all of those disciples that are sitting with Jesus as we consider what is he calling us to as a church in this next chapter, okay? And so we know in Revelations 21:14, we're told that the 12 foundations of the city of the New Jerusalem will hold the name of each of the 12 disciples. Pretty significant. Not just in the time of Jesus, but all the way to where we know the story ends in Revelation. We hear of the list of the disciples in the Gospels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then again in Acts as well. In Matthew 10:1-4, we hear that Jesus called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus, also Cleopas, and Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. In Mark 3:16-19, we get the same list. Sometimes as you go through the scriptures, you'll see that some disciples are called by multiple names. But what I want to point out before the list is where it says, Jesus went up on a mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12 that they might be with him and that he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. In Luke 6:12-16, we see one of these days that Jesus went out to the mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12, whom he also designated apostles. And then in Acts, we see the disciples are all together, of course, with the exception of Judas Iscariot, and they are along with the women, it says, in the upper room praying. This is after Jesus' ascension, and they're all together. So we see this consistency across the Gospels and in Acts of the 12 that Jesus chose. And what were they supposed to do? Because I think that's important when we look at not just who is at the table, but what was Jesus doing when he called these 12? The scripture tells us they were anointed to preach. They were given authority to drive out impure spirits or demons, to heal every disease and sickness, to pray constantly. But Jesus appointed the 12 that they might be with him, that they might be with him, and then that he might send them out, okay? So let's look at these guys. So Peter, Simon, also Simon Peter, Cephas, there's a number of different ways that Peter is referred to. He was one of Jesus's closest three. He was a fisherman, and he was a Galilean who lived in Bethsaida and Capernaum. And what I love about the Galileans, there's a Jewish historian, and his name is Josephus, and he describes the Galileans this way. They were ever fond of innovation and by nature disposed to change and delighted in sedition. They were ever ready to follow the leader and to begin an insurrection. They were quick in temper, given to quarreling, and very chivalrous men. The Talmud says this of the Galileans, that they were more anxious for honor than for gain, quick-tempered, impulsive, emotional, aroused by an appeal to adventure, and loyal to the end. I think perhaps the Galilean disciples would have been some of my favorites just for that reason. Passionate men, ready to jump in, steady and loyal to the very end. Peter, of course, is known for some of the familiar stories in the Bible. I'm sure these will not surprise you. Out of Matthew, where he walked on water, the only person besides Jesus to ever have walked on water. I don't care what the YouTube videos show with the little ramps underneath. If you've seen that, you can't really do it. He disowned Jesus to avoid persecution, we read about in Luke. He addressed the crowd on Pentecost. Of course, today is Pentecost Sunday, as Noel mentioned. And in Acts 2:14-41, he says, I assure you we're not drunk. It's only 9 a.m. in the morning, right? Like somehow that excuses them from drinking in the morning. But actually what he's probably doing is pointing to the ancient practice of fixed hour prayer. So what Peter's doing is calling out that all of the disciples are gathered together, that the power of God, the Holy Spirit is on them. Pentecost Sunday, it's fallen. And they're not drunk, but they are together in discipleship, praying as the Lord falls. Peter then goes on to talk about how God will pour his Spirit out upon all people. Sons and daughters will prophesy and see visions and dream dreams. Both men and women as servants of God will receive the pouring out of his Spirit. He's also known for asking Jesus how many times he has to forgive a brother or sister, right? And he's like, probably thinks he's being really generous when he says like 7 times, right? And Jesus is like, oh, Peter, 7 times 70, right? He's the one who wants to build the shelter on the top of the mountain and hold on to this beautiful thing that's happened as part of the transfiguration. And of course, Jesus says that he will build his church upon this rock. He was certainly a leader among the disciples. Then we have James, and James, there's actually 2 James. So James the greater and James the lesser. That'd be kind of hard to be James the lesser. Unless you're a youngest child, you may already be comfortable with that. But James the greater, again, was one of Jesus's closest 3. He was the elder son of the sons of Zebedee. He was also a fisherman, and he was the brother of John. Now, what's interesting is his name never appears apart from that of his brother. They were inseparable. And you may also remember he's the one also passionate who asked Jesus if he and John could call down fire from heaven to burn up the Samaritan village that didn't accept Jesus on his way to Jerusalem, right? This is a passionate man. He was also the first of the 12 to be recorded as martyred. He died by Herod's sword, and that's recorded in Acts 12:2. Then we have James's brother John, and he's also a son of Zebedee. He's known as the beloved disciple, or the disciple whom Jesus loved. What I love about John is he never names himself when he writes. He talks about himself as the one that Jesus loved. He was so defined by his relationship with Jesus that it took over his entire identity. He was a fisherman. He wrote the Gospel of John, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, and Revelation. He was banished to the island of Patmos. And his name, he was given another name, which I can't pronounce real well, but Boanerges or something along those lines. But it means son of thunder. And based off the research I was doing, it was saying that the sons of thunder, these 2 brothers, were probably a little, not just passionate and zealous, but maybe unable to control their responses, right? Should we call down fire from heaven, right? Very passionate. John was right there with James when that happened. He's also known for taking care of Jesus' mother, Mary, as Jesus passes his earthly family off to his closest friend. He also is the one that's quick to point out that he beat Peter to the tomb, right? As he raced to Jesus' empty tomb. And James, John, and Peter are all called the esteemed pillars of the church in Galatians 2:9. Then we've got Andrew, who's the brother of Peter. Like Peter, he lived in Bethsaida and Capernaum as a fisherman before being called by Jesus. He was actually a disciple of Jesus' cousin, John the Baptist. And he was one of the ones that when Jesus showed up, I love John the Baptist, he would say, hey, that's the guy. He was so not about himself. That's the guy. And do you know what happened? His disciples would go and follow Jesus then. I love it. And so that was this response that we see from Andrew. And he was also kind of second to his brother Peter. Peter was always mentioned first. Andrew was always referred to as Peter's brother, not the other way around. So again, if you're a youngest, that might be kind of like resonating with your spirit right now. And tradition has it that he actually was crucified after, in an evangelistic mission, the wife of a governor in Greece was healed and converted to the Christian faith. And the governor was so furious, and then his brother-in-law came to faith as well, was so furious, he had him executed. Pretty intense stuff, right? Then we have Bartholomew, also known as Nathanael, and he lived in Cana of Galilee. And he was one of the ones, the only one actually, who potentially came from noble blood of the disciples, or noble birth. There's a whole bunch of stuff in John and 2 Samuel that points back to his lineage, potentially. His name, though, Bartholomew itself, is only mentioned in the list of the disciples. And so there's some, not controversy, but some scholarly debate, I will say, about Nathanael and Bartholomew being the same. But if I were to give him a nickname, I would call him the converted skeptic. So in the book of John, when Philip first mentions Jesus, Bartholomew answers and says, Nazareth? Could anything good come out of there? Right? And then just 3 short verses later, After he's seen the miracles of the Lord, he says, "You are truly the Lord our God, the King of Israel." I kind of think of him as the converted skeptic. Then we've got Jude, or his surname Thaddeus. He is also called Judas, the brother of James, Judas Thaddeus, Judas the Zealot, or Judas not Iscariot, should we get confused of that duplication of another name. He is the son of Cleopas and Mary, which of course may sound familiar to you from the road to Emmaus journey, right? Cleopas was the disciple who was journeying with another person. A lot of scholars believe it was his wife, and encountered Jesus on the road to Emmaus. He was the brother of James, and at the Last Supper, in John 14:22, he asked Jesus, "But Lord, why do you intend to show yourself to us and not to the world? In other words, when will you reveal yourself as the ruling king?" All right, seventh, we have James the Lesser, okay, also said to be son of Alphaeus, lived in Galilee, brother of Jude, and potentially a brother of Matthew as well, because Matthew is said to have been son of Alphaeus. Matthew, of course, then he was also called Levi. He lived in Capernaum, and we know him as the criminal, right? He was the tax collector. The word is publican. And in the minds of many early century Jews, he would have just been flat out awful. He would have been considered like the mafia. He would have been taking money, extorting people, saying, "This is how much I'm going to collect," and then taking above it for his own salary and his own gain. We know that after his conversion, obviously he wrote the book of Matthew. And immediately after responding to Jesus' call of "follow me," Jesus went and had dinner at Matthew's house, right? And he was surrounded by tax collectors and sinners, and the Pharisees were pretty upset about that. Matthew's name means a gift of God, and the name Levi could have actually been given to him by Jesus himself. I love this fact that Jesus chose this man who was one of the most hated of his culture to have this incredible impact. He was one who could write, who could use a pen, and because of him, by his pen, he became the first man to actually present to the world in Hebrew language an account of the teachings of Jesus, this criminal responsible for the beginning of what we have in the Word of God. Then, of course, we have Judas Iscariot, the traitor. He betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver and then later hung himself. It's said that Judas came from Judah near Jericho. He was Judean, and the rest of the disciples were Galilean, and he was the treasurer of the group. And I always find it so incredibly powerful to imagine Judas sitting at the table, the betrayer, as Jesus knew exactly what was going to happen, exactly who was going to betray him. And yet, at the Last Supper, he said, "I'm going to literally lay my life down for you. I will sacrifice for you, my enemy who sits at the table." All right, disciple number 10, Philip. Philip came from Bethsaida, the town from which Peter and Andrew also came, near the Sea of Galilee. So it's likely that he too was a fisherman. And when Philip met Christ, he immediately found Nathanael and told him, "We found him of whom Moses and the prophets wrote." It said that he actually was hung in his death and that he requested that his body be wrapped in papyrus, not in linen as his Lord was, because he was unworthy of dying in any manner that reflected that of his Lord. You might biblically remember that he is actually the one who Jesus kind of tests a little bit in John 6, 5-7. When the 5,000 are there, Jesus turns to Philip and says, "Philip, where should we buy bread?" Isn't that fascinating? Jesus turns to him, says, "Where should we buy bread?" I wonder what he was testing him in exactly. In John 14:8, we see that he pleads of Jesus, "Show us the Father, and that will be enough for us." And of course, we know that Jesus says, "Anyone who sees me, anyone who has seen me, has seen the Father." Then we have Simon the Zealot. Now, a zealot is a fanatical Jewish nationalist. So if you think of whatever political kind of bent you stand on, think of the worst of the other guys, okay? Doesn't matter who you are. We've all got the worst of the other guys. This is what I imagine Simon the Zealot was like. A Jewish nationalist who had a heroic disregard for the suffering involved in the struggle of what they regarded was the purity of their faith that they had to uphold. They were a Jewish sect bent on revolution, and their hope and expectation that the Messiah would come to overthrow this corrupt Roman government. He's one of the more little-known followers called the Canaanite or the Zealots, lived in Galilee. Tradition says that he later went on to preach in Egypt and partnered with one of Jesus' brothers. All right, and 12th we have Thomas. Didymus is the Greek name. Thomas is the Hebrew name. And at times, I believe he's also called Judas. It's very confusing when they have all these common and similar names and they go by all these nicknames. But he also lived in Galilee. He was present at the raising of Lazarus in John 11. He was at the upper room in John 14. He wanted to know how to know where Jesus was going. He was genuinely curious. Like, I don't understand. Can you explain it to me? Right? You may know him as Doubting Thomas. And that comes from John 20:25 when he says, unless he sees the nail prints in Jesus' hand and the gash of the spear in his side, he wouldn't believe that it was really the Lord. But when he did, Jesus invited him to come and put his finger in the holes in his hand. And his response was, my Lord and my God. Now, that's a whole lot of time to talk about all of the guys that were seated at that final meal with Jesus. Right? Are you surprised by some of those? Because I always, when I'm remembering, like, wait, was that guy really part of the 12? Like, am I remembering that right? We know a couple of them really well, but I think the invitation, when we consider who's seated at Jesus' table, first of all, it's encouraging, right? Anybody has the potential to be at Jesus' table. None of these men were outside of the reach of Jesus. But what I believe the Lord has for us today is this unique opportunity to kind of consider the backwards view and the forward-looking reality out of the present. Because for the disciples, as they sat at that table, they'd had these 3 years of depth with Jesus. They'd walked with him. They'd learned from him very closely. He was their rabbi, the one that they loved. But the next chapter for the church and for the disciples couldn't happen until the present devastation of Jesus being crucified, all of their expectations and dreams being crushed. The next chapter couldn't begin until all of that had happened. So I am a person who generally thinks, stay in the present. Don't spend too much time looking back. There's not a lot we can do to change it. We have to be very present, and if we spend too much time looking forward, there's anxiety and unknown, and we can plan our steps, but the Lord's gonna make his way, right? So I'm someone who firmly says, stay in the present. And yet today represents one of those days where we get to bridge from everything SHV has been to the current reality of where we are and this next chapter of what he's calling us to step into and to be as a church. And I think it's incredibly important for us to consider, who did Jesus call? Who did Jesus call to be with him? Who did Jesus call to send? And here's the reality. This church, man, we've been through it, right? COVID, this unprecedented time, missing one another, desiring to be in community, coming back and then having the founding pastor and senior pastor and his wife go on a sabbatical and really begin this transition of praying about what the future, their next chapter looks like. The building being sold, moving on. This is a lot. Any one of those in and of themselves are hard, right? But church, this church has persevered. The word that Mike and I keep getting about SHV is this thing of remnant. This beautiful remnant of what the Lord has and desires for this church to continue to be in this community. Where the roots have gone down, where decades of faithful sowing has happened right here. And there's grief as we celebrate and we go, but it's gonna look different. I miss this. I don't understand. Where are we going? Right? I find a lot of conversations being very similar to what I imagine the disciples were going through. Not just at the Last Supper, but then as Jesus was killed, tragically, brutally murdered in front of them, and the confusion that came, the uncertainty, and then the victory that comes. There's a lot of change happening, SHV, but there's a huge invitation. And I would say that each person here, if you are in this room, if you're watching with us online, as I've prayed for you, the Lord is not far, and the Lord, I believe, is calling us as the remnant of this church to go forward into the next chapter with hope and joy and peace and excitement. And we grieve, those things come alongside. The sorrow intermingles with the joy, as it did for those disciples as they prepared for the next chapter that they had no idea what it would hold. And I think as we look at those 12, we need to remember that they were truly family. I'm always struck when I consider the actual biological connections that existed within the disciples, that group of 12, right? We've got James the Greater and John, and Andrew and Peter, and Jude and James the Lesser, and maybe James the Lesser with Matthew. Like, this is a lot of actual family connections. And then we've got John the Baptist, of course, who's the cousin of Jesus and points everyone there. And we've got Mary. And when you consider not just the Last Supper, but who was with Jesus at the cross, who was with him? And we actually see in Mark 3, 31, 35, that Jesus redefines family, doesn't he? It says, Jesus' mother and brothers arrived where Jesus was inside the house teaching. Standing outside, they sent someone in to go and get him because they were so concerned about his, I think, mental capacity and what he was claiming to be and what was going on. And so they sent someone in to retrieve Jesus, their brother and their son. And they told him, your brothers and your mother, they're outside, they're looking for you. And Jesus says, who are my mother and brothers? Then he looked at those seated with him and said, here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother. And like the disciples, I believe in this next chapter, we are called to be family together in a very life-giving, authentic, iron-sharpening iron sort of way. We are called to be family, biological family, and those chosen to sit alongside one another. Here's something else I think we're supposed to take from these 12. This rather inconsequential group of men, not the expected religious leaders or those who were of royalty, but a family comprised, by choice, some biology, of blue-collar workers, a criminal who was the most hated person culturally, radically zealous Jewish nationalists, brothers with an inability to contain themselves or their emotions, a betrayer full of selfish ambition and the love of money. This inconsequential group of men are the reason that we gather here together this morning. Think about the reality of that. These messed up band of followers of Jesus are the reason that we as Gentiles have ever even heard the word Jesus, have ever been given the opportunity to live in the freedom from sin and death that he offers. This is incredible, right? This is incredible to me. And so I started doing some research of both where the disciples preached and where they died, which sounds a little gruesome, but this is fascinating to me as I consider the next chapter Jesus ushered in with his crucifixion and then his resurrection. So Peter did evangelistic and missionary work among the Jews as far as Babylon. James preached in Jerusalem and Judea. John preached among the churches of Asia Minor. Andrew is claimed by 3 countries as their patron saint: Russia, Scotland, and Greece. He was believed to have preached in Greece and Asia Minor. Bartholomew is said to have preached with Philip in Armenia and India. Tradition says that Jude preached in Assyria and Persia. James the Lesser was said to have preached in Palestine and Egypt. Matthew, of course, could use the pen, as I mentioned, and so all of us are recipients of Matthew's direct evangelism and sharing of the word of God. Philip preached in Phrygia, I don't know how to say that, but then tradition says Simon the Zealot preached in Egypt and then later partnered with Jesus' brother, and Thomas labored in Parthia, Persia, and India. Now this picture, this map, what's interesting to me about this is some of the historical scholarly ideas of where the disciples all died, okay? So you can see right there Israel, right above Jordan, and there's like different marks. This is just kind of the blue markers are kind of commonly accepted death locations, and the yellow are maybe disputed ones of different disciples. But look at the spread that happened out of Israel, out of this tiny little Israel. This is where all of the disciples went in their next chapter, in their final chapter. This is where they went. Scholarly dispute aside, it's such an incredible thing to consider. Today, it's not that big of a deal to go, I'm going to travel to London, I'm going to travel to India, But that wasn't the case for these first century disciples, right? The spread of what happened in the next chapter, of what Jesus did by choosing these 12, this remnant of his people, his followers who stuck through it to the very brutal end. If you do any research about their deaths. So here's my question for you. Who will be influenced by you in this next chapter? Whose life will be changed because of your faithful and simple witness of Jesus? What are you witnessing? Your very livelihood, your eternity, for those of us who have said, yes, Jesus, you are my Lord and Savior, forever changed by these 12 that sat at the table with Jesus. So I want us to take a minute and consider, what do you love about SHV? When Mike and I do premarital with couples, we'll tell them each family of origin comes with beautiful things that you get to then choose, and we'll actually sometimes have them imagine they're packing a suitcase that says, what will you take from this family of origin and bring into your marriage and your family? What will you take from this family and bring in to choose to be intentionally part of yours? What are the things that you will actually not take with you? You will say, I'm definitely not packing that, right? Because every family has those things too. So I want you to remember this morning, what drew you here? And what has planted your feet here? And for those of you who are like, man, I don't know, I just came in here. This is my first Sunday. This is really confusing. That's okay. You're here for a reason. Those maybe who say, I don't actually even know why I'm still here. That's okay as well. But as Mike and I have been meeting with different teams, different leadership teams, we've been going around to all of the different ministry areas and meeting with leaders, and we've heard some very beautiful and consistent themes of the things that have drawn people in and have rooted them in this particular body. I'm going to read just a few of those. The first being the power of God's Spirit, radically changing lives, encountering people. That's not tied to this room, if you didn't know that. It's not tied to this building. This is the family of Christ. No matter where we go, the power of God's Spirit is with us. And what I love about SHV is that there's this authentic and not hyped up, not drummed up, not cheerleaded in, but just the power of God that falls upon people as they willingly say yes and open their hands to him. Over and over again, we've heard of how the Lord has encountered you. Radical salvations, healing, being set free from addiction, forgiven of sin that you thought unforgivable. A couple of years ago, we were actually at a Vineyard Denver. There was like a huge pastors conference, all national pastors came to Denver. And we were there, and Mike and I had been going through the season. We felt like, oh my goodness, there has to be more to ministry than trying to just grab people off the edges, going, you're a little far that way, and everybody come into the middle, because God has this powerful, radical middle that exists that we are able to step into the stream of, right? And I remember the Lord saying, it's not about tuning down people who are bent this way or bent that way in the Spirit of God, but it's actually about turning all of the power up, not just to 10, not all the way up, but to 11. Like that we get to go in the middle of exactly what the Lord is doing, the power of his Spirit at 11. We just go all the way in. So we work to ensure that God's Spirit is welcome, empowered here, and that human weirdness doesn't get in the way. I love that about SHV, right? Worship has grabbed hearts, not just at SHV, but the Vineyard historically has been so powerful in worship. I don't know about you, but I was reminded last week when we met with the worship leadership team of how that's how I first encountered the Lord's Spirit. I didn't even understand what it was, but I would weep and weep and weep and go, I don't know what's wrong with me. I don't know what this is. And SHV has so faithfully welcomed authentic, passionate worship of the Lord, where it expresses our intimacy with him. There's been this consistent theme of ministry to those who are underserved. Kingdom justice that builds bridges. We look to alleviate poverty by meeting practical needs with our Hope Starts Here food bank. We work to repair those deep wounds that have been caused at the hands of racial injustice. We become stewards of creation care, good stewards that reflect that God gave us something to tend and care well for. This is all kingdom justice. Over and over again, we've heard of families of single parents whose needs were met right here in this church, whose lives were sustained through some of the darkest seasons, who were welcomed in, not on condition of looking like you are a nuclear family that does this or does that, but welcomed in because Jesus says you're welcome here. There's a seat for you at this table. Those who have been divorced and said, I thought I would be disqualified from ever being used in God's kingdom. The faithful who have come. There's been rich training historically. I know I have gotten trained here, right? I went through VLI here. I've gotten a chance to try it out, that everybody gets a chance to play. What an incredible thing. Have you ever been involved with another church? That's not often the case. These are beautiful parts of our SHV DNA that need to go with us, and many more. I mean, I really could talk about all of the stories that I've heard over and over and over again. And if you don't know, historically, there's this prophetic word about SHV that, and many of you probably have heard this, but that speedboats were like coming into this building, that this place was a place where speedboats came running in and they would get gassed up and then they'd get sent out, right? Have you ever heard that word about SHV? And about a year ago, Mike and I were in California and we were walking. I grew up on the Oregon coast, so I was trying to get this picture of sea anemones. So I'm trying to video for my kids. So does anyone know you touch them and they all go close up? So I was trying to get this picture and I'm standing in the water. And it actually was not a very bright day. It was a pretty cloudy day. It was just kind of blah, right? Which is fine. So I'm over a little bit further to the right here. I'm over in the rocks and I'm climbing in trying to get the sea anemones to do their thing so I could video it for my kids. And then I see this picture of water, not that one, coming over the rocks. And the water is washing over all of the life. And it changed the whole color. Everything became vibrant. I mean, you can see how beautiful it was. The sun is reflecting off all of the little pieces, and all of a sudden it just came to life. This gray, kind of dull day where I'm standing in the rocks comes to life. And I came back and I was actually sharing with the staff, and I said, I had the most incredible thing of the relentless move of the water over and over again. And that when that happens, it washes and it brings things to life. Vibrant, beautiful things that are in each one of us. And of course, that takes me back to John 4, where Jesus says, whoever drinks the water I give will never thirst. The water I give them will become in them a spring of water welling up to eternal life. The water of the Lord relentlessly washing over us and bringing to life those things that he has. The beauty of everything that has been, the promise of what the next chapter has to give each one of us. So I'm going to invite the worship team back up, and I really want to come back to what Jesus spoke through Peter, right? Peter shared about the disciples of Jesus on the day of Pentecost, which how significant is that, right? That's the day that sons and daughters will prophesy, will see visions, will dream dreams. Both men and women as servants of God will receive the pouring out of his Spirit, the living water that he makes available. So as we worship and as we close out service, I want to invite you to just ask the Lord to do that with you. Would you ask him to wash over you with his living water, to bring forth the things that he has called you to be? And let's see what he wants to speak, because I have a feeling he's got some incredible pictures, prophetic words, a vision for the future as we celebrate everything we've been. Okay. If you'd like prayer, we will have the ministry team available while we close in worship. And all of you in the room, we're going to come back after the worship song and we'll give you some instructions for today. And when we wrap up online, please pray. If you have the Lord give you pictures or words, would you share those with us? Send them in.
Thank you again for joining us live or through SHV at home today, especially if today was your first time visiting.
What comes next for you? If you aren't sure where to start, please download the SHV app, or if you're here in the room, come on back to the Connect table to talk with me after service.
And we'd love to see you online next Sunday.
May God bless your week with his presence, his peace, and his power.